The ballroom felt like a stage, and I had been sitting in the wrong seat the whole time. My name is Tom. For 4 years, I called Olivia my wife. On paper, we had everything. A comfortable home, reliable cars, the sort of life that looks tidy in photographs and pleasant in small talk. Up close, though, cracks run through everything, and they always do where you least expect them. Mine had been growing under the surface for a long time, and the wedding last Saturday simply pulled the last brick loose. The wedding was for one of her college friends, a big glamorous thing in a hotel that smelled of perfume and money. Olivia loves that. Lights, laughter, an audience. She'd told me she was excited, and I believed her. I expected the usual. A few dances, a bite of cake, some polite toasts. Instead, the night became its own quiet verdict. She danced with Ben all night. Not a polite partner in the corner, but the kind of dance that looks like a conversation with bodies. Leaning in, laughing too loud, walking away together as if the whole room belonged to them. People nudged each other, smiled, took photos. Once during a lull, someone pointed at Olivia's ring and asked the obvious question. "Are you married to him?" She didn't just answer. She performed. She made that little brittle laugh people use when they want to wound without leaving fingerprints, then said, "I'm married, but not to Ben, unfortunately." She leaned closer like she was sharing a secret. "Not really, though. It doesn't count when he's boring." The group laughed politely, with that condescending warmth that cuts like a knife. I stood maybe 20 feet away, near the bar, talking to the groom's uncle. The ring shone on her finger. I realized in that frozen second that everyone else was seeing what I'd been pretending not to know. It wasn't a single line in a script. It was 1,000 tiny edits. The way she angled her phone away when he messaged. The way she'd mention him first in conversations. The way her enthusiasm for my plans had cooled to a distant, obligatory nod. The laugh was the proof. I gave her a small nod from across the room, the kind of nod a husband offers at parties. Attentive, supportive, invisible. In my head, it was a different thing entirely. An acknowledgement, an endnote. I turned and left the ballroom without ceremony. The party kept going. My marriage didn't. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't smash plates or shout in public. I read people. I plan. Those are my tools. For months, I'd been watching small things collect into patterns. The anniversary trip 8 months earlier was the moment I stopped hoping and started planning. I'd poured hours into finding the perfect cabin in the mountains, thinking of the quiet we used to love. When I showed her the pictures, she was lukewarm. The next day, she had a better idea. A coastal resort, a place Ben had suggested. It wasn't a suggestion. It was already decided between them. I spent 4 days on that trip watching her send him pictures of the view. That was when I realized I was not her partner anymore. I was the infrastructure that made her social life possible. I was maintenance, reliable but unremarkable. So I planned. Not with rage or a desire for spectacle, but with the polished practicality of someone who has learned to take care of himself. First came a trip to a lawyer, a 90-minute consultation to map out rights, liabilities, and the protections I needed. The house was mine. I'd bought it years before I met Olivia. That was lucky. The lawyer advised me on the obvious and the less obvious. Update beneficiaries, separate accounts, document everything. I did as he said. The movement was stealthy and clinical. I opened new accounts at a different bank and began funneling my income there. I left just enough in the joint account to keep the lights on and the routine humming, so there would be no dramatic alarms. I changed passwords, made copies of important papers, and seeded a folder full of notes. Dates, texts, small transgressions laid bare in chronological order. I kept my public face the same. Pleasant, attentive, the kind of husband people would easily believe is oblivious to anything darker than a missing sock. Private life, public calm. It was a necessary lie. Saturday night finished the file. Olivia had been in her element, dazzling and loud, spending our shared card for a dress she remarked was pricey and worth it. She clung to Ben in a way that made a performance of possession out of something that was not hers to claim. When the laugh happened and the room accepted the joke, I accepted that my role in this marriage was over. I walked out. Back in the hotel room, I did not yell or slam doors. The first thing I did was exactly what I'd planned in private hours. I packed a small overnight bag with a few essentials, grabbed the one meaningful photo I wanted to keep, and took every document that mattered: passports, the house deed, bank information, hidden copies of our joint statement logs. I plugged in my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet I had been keeping for months. It listed transfers, the new accounts, a simple timeline of when things had happened. I sent a single, carefully worded email to the lawyer. I left the wedding. Need to begin separation process. Can we meet tomorrow morning? Polite, efficient, sealed. Sleep did not come easily. I lay awake thinking about how marriages can dilapidate slowly and silently until all that's left is habit and the polite smiles of strangers. I thought of the way she used to look at me with real affection in the first year, that warm vulnerability before the cynicism. Somewhere along the way, our lives had become parallel tracks. We occupied the same house, but were racing different directions. That morning when she woke up alone, I imagined her confusion and thought of the laugh. Small, petty, final. I had no urge to fix it with a speech. The time for words had passed. The time for action had arrived. The next day I saw the lawyer. We sat in a bright office with tasteful plants and stronger coffee than I drink at home. The paperwork was a ritual, forms to fill, declarations to sign. He explained how the separation would work here, what to expect, how custody, if we needed to address any, would be handled. We didn't have children. He drew out the options: mediation, contested divorce, quick uncontested separation. I told him I wanted it clean, efficient, and private. He advised caution against any rash moves, especially anything that would make me look angry or unstable. I nodded and signed the papers. After the meeting, I walked through the city with my hands in my pockets, feeling oddly light. People were going about their usual errands, oblivious to the tectonic shift in my life beneath their feet. I called a close friend and told him, in as few words as possible, what had happened. He offered support and a place to stay if I needed it. I said thank you and told him I'd be fine. Later that week, I moved some of my things to his spare room: books, a few shirts, my laptop. I left the house in her name for now. It made legal sense. And, frankly, I didn't want to litter the place with the bitter residue of a messy exit. I'd seen enough of those films where people burn bridges spectacularly. I preferred the quiet pragmatism of a door closed softly but for good. The hardest parts were not the logistics, but the small betrayals replaying in my head. The way she compared me to Ben in conversation, as if a best friend's imagined approval was more valuable than the person she'd promised to spend her life with. The way our plans had slowly been replaced by someone else's suggestions. The small prioritizations that accumulate into a life someone else is living. I found myself rereading old texts, searching for the moment the pattern began. In the end, it didn't matter where the changes began. It only mattered that I recognized them for what they were, and finally gave myself permission to walk. People like to imagine divorce as a sudden thing, a volcanic eruption of blame and fireworks. For me, it felt like closing a book I had read too many times. The last chapter had been written in a laugh. The epilogue would be paperwork and a life rearranged. And there were practicalities. Insurance policies needed updating. The car's registrations had to be checked. Passwords changed. The joint credit cards closed. I moved deliberately through a checklist like a man refitting his life's armor. Olivia called a few days later. She was surprised but not distraught. Surprised, perhaps, that I could be so invisible a presence one night and so final the next. Her voice was composed. She asked me to meet and speak. I agreed to one mediated conversation. In public, she wore the same practiced smile that had deflected questions at the wedding. Up close, she was a little brittle, like an ornament dropped in a rush and quickly reset. She asked if I was angry. I told her I was weary. She asked if there was anyone else. I said no. She asked what it was she had done wrong. I told her it wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small permissions she gave herself to be uncommitted while keeping all the perks of marriage. I thought you were being protective, she said once, eyes glossy with something that may have been contrition or theatrics. I thought I was free to be myself. The words sounded rehearsed, Or maybe they were simply the only explanation she could give herself that didn't require admitting she'd chosen someone else emotionally. I understood that. I also understood something else. Sometimes people don't realize how much power their habits have to hurt others. Freedom, for one person, can feel like betrayal to another. There were moments of awkwardness that will probably follow us both for a while. Mutual friends chose sides in polite whispers. Gifts were returned in envelopes with folded notes. But for the most part, the separation moved with a certain decency. I filed the petition. She got her day with a mediator. The legalities were boring and at times humiliating. Forms that asked for financial disclosures made me feel like I was being interviewed about a past life. But the process moves you through like a river pushes a canoe. It takes effort, but eventually you feel the current and then you are on land. People asked how I felt afterward. At first the feeling was numbness edged with relief. There was no triumphant gloating, no cinematic revelation. There were mornings when I made coffee and the habit of a shared cup felt uncanny. There were nights when the bed felt too big and the silence had weight. But slowly, like the slow light of morning climbing over a hill, I felt lighter. Part of that was practical, the removal of constant friction. And part of it was the strange gift that honesty gives. The clarity of aligning your life with the truth, even if it's inconvenient or painful. Months later, when the divorce was final, I found that the world had not ended. My friends were still friends. My routines reassembled into new patterns, and the small joys, a clean kitchen at night, an uninterrupted Sunday morning, felt quietly indulgent. I met new people. I read books I had shelved. I took a trip alone to a small town in the country and learned the pleasure of deciding at every turn without consulting someone else. There was grief, yes, for what had been, for the version of myself that believed in a future we had imagined together. But grief is not a prison. It's a room you pass through and one day leave with a handful of souvenirs and better sense of direction. Olivia and I did not become enemies. We became two people who had shared part of a life and found that the shape of their futures did not include each other. That is a quiet, almost adult conclusion. It lacks the fireworks of revenge plots and the cheap catharsis of public shaming. It has instead an odd dignity. She remarried a year later, which surprised a few people, but not me. She is someone who thrives in crowds and performance. I genuinely wish her well. I wish for us both the kind of contentment that is not flashy but steady, the slow, reliable comfort of a life chosen with eyes open. If there's one thing I want people to take from this, it's that marriages are not fixed monuments. They are living things that require tending. When one person stops tending and begins to test the boundaries of their commitment, the other person is allowed, even obligated, to respond. Sometimes that means conversation, sometimes that means therapy, and sometimes it means quietly building an exit that preserves your stability and dignity. I do not tell this story to boast. I tell it because there's a kind of relief in truth. I didn't explode into public accusations. I didn't try to humiliate her or make her pay for being cruel. I planned, I protected, I executed the plan with calm precision. I chose to step away rather than cling to an illusion. That was the hardest and yet the best part. The final image I carry is simple. A laugh in a hotel ballroom, like a pin dropped on a map that points to reality. It was small and ordinary, and yet it said everything. It told me who she was in that moment and who I had become to her. It told me that staying would have been a slow, kind death of self. So I left. Now some evenings I sit on my small balcony with a cup of coffee and the city spread out below. I think of the years that shaped me and the choices that remade me. I think of the way a life can turn on a small, callous sentence. It doesn't count when he's boring, and how that tiny cruelty can save you from a longer, duller ruin. I don't miss the performance. I miss the person we once promised to become. But I am glad I found a way out before the laugh became an echo that never stopped.